So today's clip we're going to be talking about pollination. So pollination it's the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. And of course it can happen in two different ways. It can happen when you get the transfer of pollen from the anther of the same flower to the stigma of the same flower, and we call this self-pollination. So it's the same flower, so anther to stigma. And of course we get cross-pollination, which is the transfer of pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another. Whether the pollination is either self or cross-pollination, we need some form of vector or means of transferring the pollen. The vectors can take two forms. We can have both wind, or indeed vectors such as animals, or more commonly often are insects such as butterflies, and of course our bees. So now we're going to focus on the steps involved in pollination. So we have a zoomed in version here of the carpel. Of course this is made up of the top region, which is the stigma, which generally is quite sticky in insect pollinated plants. We have the kind of middle region, which we call the style. We have the region which contains all the ovules, called the ovary, and of course the individual eggs, called the ovules. Now, when a pollen grain lands, be it by wind or by a vector of some sort, such as an insect, e.g. a bee or a butterfly, the pollen grain will land on the stigma, which, as I mentioned, was sticky. In response to this, a structure called a pollen tube begins to grow. It grows down the style. It grows down the style towards the ovary. And what's responsible for this are enzymes which digest their way down. The next thing that happens is the pollen grain, now not the grain in its entirety, but instead the nucleus of that grain will travel down this pollen tube towards the ovary, and it will enter in a region called, not necessary to know but quite useful, called the micropyle. Once the pollen grain nucleus reaches the ovules, which are here, what will happen is fertilisation will take place. As per usual, we have two haploid gametes coming together to form a diploid zygote. What will happen then is the ovary, this whole region, will begin to swell to form fruit. And then finally, those ovules within the ovary will actually become the seeds, with the ovule wall becoming the hard, tough outer coat of the seed called the testa. Now, to put a real life example in this, if you think about eating an apple, the apple is basically a swollen ovary of the apple tree, and the seeds or the pips inside are the ovules. So to summarize the steps in pollination, the pollen grain lands on the sticky stigma of the carpel. A pollen tube begins to grow down through the style, enzymes digest its way down, and it makes its way to the ovary. Then a pollen grain nucleus, and it's very important to emphasize nucleus, travels down the pollen tube towards the ovary and enters at the bottom through the micropyle. This nucleus will fuse with the ovule, and this is fertilization, will take place between the pollen grain nucleus and the ovule nucleus. This whole region, the ovary, begins to swell to form a fruit, and any ovules which are present will become the seeds, with the ovule walls becoming the tough outer coat called the testa.